She thought 20 years would fix what death had broken. It was a small arithmetic of hope. Add 2 decades of steadiness, subtract the trembling nights and the ways grief rearranged her body, and what remained would be something like safety. Nora had sketched the math in the margins of her calendar, in the quiet between feeding a child and answering emails, in the reflexive clicking of a bracelet on her wrist, a narrow silver band that had once felt like armor. When she imagined the future, it had a silhouette older than hers, slower jokes, practiced hands, a wardrobe that cost more than the mortgage. It promised a kind of adult certainty she could wear like a coat and step into the cold, no longer raw, no longer small. That promise lived in a dozen small choices. She had let waiters seat her at tables where men ordered the expensive bottle without checking the price. She had listened politely to older voices that pronounced consolation and plan as if they were interchangeable. She had said yes to lunches that felt more like interviews for the role of someone else's safe harbor. Each time she left those dates, she told herself the same thing. Just one night more, and maybe the calculus would tip. But the bracelet never stopped tapping against her skin. It reminded her that protection could be a weight. It chimed in the half-lights, the humming dishwasher at 2 a.m., the list of things she would have to remember for school pickups, the quiet phone calls to ask about bills. To make someone else steady required work she had not anticipated, a performance she felt obliged to rehearse. The older men's certainty frequently arrived braided with assumptions, that her grief needed fixing by an anchor of status, that the neatness of their lives could stitch hers, that the cost of belonging was the steady surrender of small freedoms. She began to notice that the very thing she thought would stop the ache tethered her to a new one. It was not freedom she would buy. It was another set of expectations, another kind of vigilant labor. Day to day, that illusion grew heavier. Simone had been the kind of friend who measured danger like seasoning, too much and all flavor died. On the phone, with the line full of holiday traffic, she had said Nora sounded like a thing she needed to break open gently. "Come," Simone insisted. "A party. A tiny place. They do a blind Christmas thing. It's civic, it's warm, and yes, somebody I know thinks of you. He's kind, he's older, which you asked for." There had been an edge to Simone's voice that she recognized as both matchmaking and defiance. She had been trying to be brave for months. Sometimes bravery meant stepping into someone else's plan and seeing if it fit. Nora wanted to say no. The cold in the window of her apartment persuaded her otherwise. Winter had a way of compressing decision into a smaller, harder shape.
Fridays were for checking other people's thermometers. The child's after-school teacher. The neighbor's Christmas lights. A blind date on Christmas Eve felt less like a swerve than like a posted sign she could follow. Do this, and perhaps the loneliness would be interrupted. She put on the bracelet, smoothed the soft scarf she always kept for nights out, and let Simone prop a hopeful eye on her as she stepped into the cab. The restaurant was a place that smelled of butter and evergreen. Low lights, red holly, plates that slid across tables like small boats. Patricia, the owner, greeted them at the door with hands rough as proof of hard happiness, her laugh a small, steady bell. Nora saw the room arranged in a dozen private combustions, couples leaning like careful guesses, families with small children who dipped spoons into puddles of molten chocolate, strangers who attempted to make themselves into other people's stories for a single meal. Evan sat with a child tucked into his side and a hand worn from both work and the slow mercy of widowing. He had the sort of easy silence Nora mistook for certainty at first glance, a man who knew how to be still in the middle of a conversation. His daughter, small, laminated in a coat far too bright for the weather, glanced at Nora with the directness children have for the unadorned facts of someone's face. The girl's name was Mia, if the way she announced it mattered. It did. Children who speak with the bluntness of truth often make adults misplace their defenses. They started as strangers who had been pre-ordered by optimism. The first half hour was polite and cautious. Nora made the jokes she had read in a list of best straights to breakers, and received smiles she mistook for invitations. Evan listened, the lines at his eyes folding like soft beliefs. He was not the old Ondam of Nora's ledger of hope. He was close to her age. He carried instead a quiet that hinted at a loss. He would occasionally glance at Mia, who threw shapes across a napkin, houses with extra windows, stick figures that held hands. The girl's drawings resembled a map of what people wanted to believe. Shelter, arms, continuity. Under the garland, over-chipped china, both Nora and Evan discovered, in small, careful sentences, the contour of each other's griefs. He had not come to wear a steady cloak of someone else's dignity. His widowhood was recent enough to leave bruised edges and old enough to teach him the grammar of patience. Nora spoke guardedly of what had happened to the person she had loved before, not with the rawness that ripped from her in the first months, but with the flat, cool details that act as survival technique. Dates, medical appointments, the particular way grief had colonized her sleep. She found herself saying things she had only said in the shower. It doesn't go away, it rearranges. Sometimes it asks for proof that you are alive.
Mia, small and observant, listened with the ease of someone filing evidence. She asked questions that adults typically filtered through the polite scaffolding of not too much. "Do you miss him?" she asked without prelude, and when Nora nodded, the child leaned in and said simply, "My mama sings to the stars when she misses Dad. It helps, but not all the time." That level of truth required no story to make it bearable. It landed, soft and inevitable, like snow. The room outside them performed ritual warmth. Glasses clinked, a chorus murmured from the bar. The radiator hummed like a small, repentant animal. Someone nearby, a man whose suit had the sheen of being paid for by a particular kind of certainty, allowed himself the liberty of staring. Damon sat with his back to a framed winter scene, a man who looked as if his life had been stitched from the same fabric as expensive oak. His age read as advantage, fingers adorned with inherited maps of rings, posture that suggested he had never needed to ask for help. He watched Nora with an arithmetic of attention that felt too measured to be innocent. Nora felt the attention like a second skin. She adjusted the bracelet and lied to herself about why she flinched. She had practiced being seen by older men, how to tilt her smile to hint at competence, how not to ask for help too soon. Silence became a kind of currency. With it, she could purchase a moment of perceived steadiness. Damon's gaze priced her with the coolness of the auctioneer. A part of her entertained that currency. It was flattering, dangerous, and oddly consistent with the ledger she'd kept with herself in the dim of nights. Between soup and the first plates of roast, Nora learned that Damon knew Simone through philanthropic circles, which, in the dialect of their town, meant he was the kind of man who gave money and received attention in a tidy public cycle. When he crossed over to their table just to say hello, Nora noticed the slip in his smile. It was rehearsed, the kind of smile practiced in hotel mirrors. He made an offhand comment about helping people like her, and the phrase landed like a hand on the back of her neck. Well-intended, perhaps, but startlingly condescending, like someone handing a life jacket to a capable swimmer. Evan's jaw tightened. He had the small, private flame of a man who scrutinized not just words, but the effect of words on the people directly across from them. For a second, their eyes met, and Nora read something like a dare, to accept the mantle of being pitied, or to refuse it. Her fingers curled into the curve of the bracelet, as if to steady herself. They finished dinner on the temper of shared grief and curt smiles. It was not the older man's salvation Nora had catalogued in her fantasies. It was, by contrast, an imperfect companionship that invited nothing but honesty for what it had to offer, the presence of someone who also feared how fragile the next day might be.
They left with exchange of numbers on the margin of promises to meet again that were less like transactions and more like fragile attempts at building a rack to hang small new habits on. Nora's chest felt unsteady in a way that was almost new, the possibility of being known, not rescued. If this already feels familiar, if you can remember a night when you thought a single person could change the arithmetic of your life, tell me where. Type the name of your city. It matters somehow which places hold these small miracles and which hold only echoes. Outside, the city had folded itself into winter. Snow came in slow, assigned sheets that blurred streetlights into soft orbs. Nora pulled her scarf up against it the way one might pull a curtain closed, though the brilliance of the season showed no mercy for curtains. The cab ride home was a shallow, private moment. Lights smudged across the windows, the bracelet catching slants like reflections, memories braided with the static of traffic. It was while she was removing her coat in the apartment that she felt the first familiar tightening in her chest. Not exactly panic, but the old domestic anxiety waiting to be set off by any small bump in the night. The child's list had been tucked into her bag. New boots, a note for the teacher about a missing mitten. Small responsibilities ellipsed the edges of her longing for a different kind of partner. The thought flitted like a sparrow. If she chose an older man, would this white noise of worry fade? Could another adult absorb the infinitesimal ledger of daily life? The thought was a temptation disguised as logic. Her phone vibrated with a message from Simone, a string of laughing emojis and a photo of the restaurant's wreath. Beneath it, a forwarded profile. Damon Caldwell, local philanthropist, thoughtful, generous. Simone's tone seemed to imply both a warning and a dare. Nora folded the message into the small pocket of her mind marked, "Not now." For the first time in a long while, the decision to keep trying small, imperfect connection felt honest rather than cowardly. The next evening, as the storm that the forecast had promised staged itself into more earnest behavior, Nora found herself thinking about what 20 years had meant in practice. It meant not only experience and steadiness, but also a license to decide for someone else. When she imagined those older hands, they were frequently hands that had never been asked to make lunches or clean up a couch sticky with juice. They smelled like offices and neat economies, not like the flour dust of pancakes on Saturday mornings. She realized with a little shock that in all her anxious cataloging, she had been chasing not merely age but a life that required less shared smallness. It had felt, in winter, like the cure to the extra labor of being two people living in one grief-haunted house. On the morning the storm announced itself in earnest, the town seemed to hold its breath.
News feeds filled with phrases like whiteout and travel advisory. Nora read them with a tightness that made her stomach flop, the way a pulled curtain can startle a quiet room. She had arranged to pick up Mia after school, a promise she kept with a kind of manual faith built in places without family nearby. Evan had been generous in arranging the logistics. "I'll be late at work," he had said in a voice that made apologies sound like offerings. "But Patricia's place has a generator. If anything happens, we'll wait there." It was the sort of sentence that made Nora imagine a safe net, though she had learned the hard, quiet truth that safety nets sometimes had holes. By late afternoon, the wind made of paper and bone began to take shape. Schools closed early. The streets took on the look of a town trying to remember itself from a postcard. Nora bundled Mia into her car with the practiced precision of someone who had learned the choreography of young bodies. Zipped coats, corrected scarves, the steadying hand to make sure the mitten had not been lost. Mia sang bits of children's songs under her breath, like someone threading a rope. She liked to invent stories about how stars listened to children's wishes and saved them in jars. Nora wondered, not for the first time, how small promises added up to something larger, whether songs and small goodness could stitch a life. The drive to Evan's neighborhood was white and taut. Branches bowed like old men. The radio fizzed with warnings. Nora took the streets that cut through the town center, where neighborhoods gathered near the warmth of small businesses, because there, at the heart of town, the community still liked the idea of being neighborly. Patricia's restaurant glowed ahead like a harbor. Outside, people clustered in the door's frame to throw their faces into the warmth and to check others for signs of misfortune. A man carried in a wet dog with a look of grudging amusement. Someone else clutched an umbrella and a crate of grocery milk. Inside the restaurant was a small, improvisational shelter. Tables had been pushed together, candles multiplied in the cold like hopeful flames. Patrons who had been strangers were now bound by the same basic fact. The world had betrayed the timetable of their plans, and they had to choose how to respond to that betrayal. Nora felt the heat against her cheeks, immediate and peculiar. People traded food like salutations. A child asked for and received 2 helpings of mashed potatoes, as if hoarding calories could soothe the storm. Evan and Mia were already there, huddled at a corner table, the girl's bright coat folded across the bench. Evan's face held the thin tiredness of someone who had been balancing grief and responsibility for a long time. His hands had a way of arranging utensils into order that suggested he tried to make sense of small things, so big ones might be less angling to swallow him. He waved Nora over, the way one waves a friend into the clean parts of an evening. "You're just in time," he said, though he could not have been sure of what time meant in a room where everything had been postponed. The mood in the restaurant shifted with the storm. The generator hummed, a necessary substitute for the city's failed pride. Conversation folded into shared stories that were less about performance and more about the need to be found. People revealed injuries and triumphs, and their admissions had a blunt honesty that pried at the scab of Nora's habit for pretense. She watched as other guests, factory workers, teachers, an elderly man in a knit cap, set down their defenses like coats at the door. For once, she felt she could let hers lie where they would. Damon arrived like a ripple in otherwise steady water. He had the kind of entrance that suggested he had calculated the amount of warmth he wanted to absorb.
He moved through the room with an ease, belonging to someone who expected things to bend in his trajectory. He had a small retinue, 2 acquaintances, who laughed at the exact times one expects laughter to punctuate wealth. He greeted Patricia like a long-term creditor of goodwill, and smiled at Nora with the politeness of someone extending a temporary favor. "Storm's got everyone in," he said, sweeping in a hand that encompassed the crowd as though it were a collection he had curated. His voice wound around the room and left a faint residue of permission. He made a joke about the generator being the restaurant's secret asset, and the way he said asset sounded less like pragmatism and more like a ledger. He asked Nora, with the kind of interest that tested boundaries, "So what do you do, Nora? How do you manage on your own?" The question carried, beneath it, an assumption that appealed to the part of her that measured safety in how many forms of competence one could list aloud. Nora answered as she often did, with a quiet summary of herself that kept the deepest edges tucked away, the way one trims a photograph to fit a frame. She would not let his tone dictate how she understood herself. There was relief in not being undone in public. Yet Damon's flattery was a small, corrosive finger that pried at her resolve. It implied that she might deserve charity, and in the same breath offered a podium where pity could be mistaken for concern. She caught herself responding in the old pattern: deflect with a joke, keep the conversation light, avoid asking for anything that could be used later as proof of need. As the evening deepened, the storm became a punctuation mark that refused to be ignored. A wind-borne sound scraped the windows. Snow began to heap against the door like white arguments. Electric lights blinked, steadied, then went out with the finality of a decision that cannot be reversed. Lamps fell to candlelight.
For a heartbeat, the room seemed like a scene from another century. Diners leaning forward, faces shaded by the flicker, the radiator now a mythic furnace. When the power died, Nora felt it like a small physical loss, a strip of certainty gone. The generator stuttered, then took over with a hum, but the rhythm of the room had changed. In the dim, she watched faces she had seen in 100 small interactions tighten and then relax into a new nervousness. Someone suggested board games. Patricia produced extra blankets from a back room like a magician revealing the next act. Outside, the storm's appetite was obvious. Snowflakes thickened into a curtain, and the gusts bent the trees into supplication. A panicked voice came from the street. Someone had skidded, a car downed a lamp, or perhaps a person had been caught unaware on the sidewalk. The restaurant's patronage, warmed then softened by candlelight, turned attention outward with the human inclination to witness and respond. Evan's posture changed. He stood with a kind of compressed readiness that made the muscles in his arm look like maps of preparedness. "Stay," he told Nora, but it was not the possessive sentence that reads as control. It was an offer. Stay here where there are people, or go out into the storm alone. He gestured for Mia to come closer, to tuck into a shared blanket, and then turned toward the door where the gusts hammered at the glass. He was one of those people whose impulse was to move toward danger in order to reduce someone else's risk. Nora had not expected to be the sort of person who watched others act. She had thought herself wheeled by the momentum of grief, reactive, tired, private. But a sudden brittle alertness rose in her, that old, sharp survival sense that had once pushed her to learn the names of medical staff or to memorize phone numbers at odd hours. The dinner plates had become a tiny community in the way that trains of survivors make temporary homes and stations. People began to stand, shoes scraping across wet tile. Someone shouted for coats. A man lifted a lantern. Across the room, Damon moved with the ease of a man who thought the world existed to be entered when he announced himself. He offered to drive an elderly couple home, a gesture that on its face appeared generous. But Nora's skin remembered what generosity sometimes disguised: choices made by the powerful, under the assumption that those without power would be grateful rather than equals. She watched him tie his scarf with the casual confidence of a pianist who has not lost his touch. For a moment a thought flickered through her, a small old temptation to accept an offer of being escorted home by the man who symbolized all she had once imagined safety to be. Then the lights faltered again. The generator coughed. A loud crash carried from the front. someone colliding with the door as the wind pushed unevenly. Glass vibrated in its frames like distant thunder.
A collective breath left the room. The doors rattled on their hinges. Evan moved fast, the kind of motion that cut through the rhetoric of conversation and found the core of an emergency. He stepped into the vestibule and opened the door. Cold tried to devour the warmth. Snow pressed its face right up to the threshold. He saw a shivering bundle on the pavement, half obscured by a coat, a figure trying to stand. Without hesitation, he drew the person into his arms and into the restaurant with a firm, almost fierce gentleness. It was a movement that left no room for heroes and left no time for later regrets. It was simply what had to be done. For a moment, the room was a collection of reactions. Someone pulled a blanket over the rescued person's shoulders. Plates were set aside, and hands made tea, as if their utility could supply consolation. Patricia moved with the businesslike compassion of someone who had been tending crises long enough to know the exact measure of comfort in hot soup. Nora found herself reaching for chairs, for hot mugs, feeling the small economy of aid become immediate work. Her fingers brushed the bracelet as she turned the kettle. The silver band caught a candlelight and flashed, a tiny shard of bright against a night that felt intent on swallowing too much. Standing there, amidst the small flurry of rescue, Nora felt the familiar pressure in her chest dissolve into a pragmatic focus. There was a place to stand, a role she could fill, and for the first time in a long time, the work of helping someone else felt not like a performance to earn a future safety, but as a present fact, simple and honest. The older man, Damon, hovered at the edge of the crowd, his expression composed as if the evening were a carefully arranged photograph. He clapped a hand on Nora's shoulder in a kind of patronizing intimacy and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "We didn't expect you to be so capable, Nora. Good thing some of us keep an eye on the town." The sentence landed like a small cold weight. Gratitude on his lips, but tinged with the assumption of charity. Nora's hands found the edge of the table. The word capable tasted like a gift, but she recognized the familiar economy. To be praised for doing what had to be done, to be softened into the role of someone else's benevolent design. The old barter of pity at the cost of being understood had always felt like a currency she never asked for. She looked at Evan then, who was handing a warm cup to Mia with the kind of attention that made the child's smile expand in a way that was unstudied and true. In that half-second, Nora registered, not as a neat revelation, but as a slow, dawning recognition, that the kind of help Evan offered was not a purchase. It was messy, often intrusive, sometimes insufficient, and always subject to negotiation. It required mutual clumsiness and the soft willingness to be inconvenienced for another's good.
That small observation, more than any polished dinner or philanthropic handshake, felt like a shape she could live in. Outside, the wind punched the windows again. The rescue had redistributed the room into a cluster of people who now had stories to tell each other that were not rehearsed. Plates were slid closer for sharing. Mia leaned against Nora, her warmth a small geographic certainty. The bracelet, which until that evening had felt like an accessory, now seemed to hum with a different sort of energy, not armor, but a reminder of choices. But the night was not finished testing them. Voices outside turned sharp, and a cry that was not part of the room's slow healing rose from the street. Someone shouted about a car stuck at the corner and a driver who might be trapped. There was a tilt in the air, the way a teaspoon tilts before it spills. People rose, moving toward the door with the new purpose of rescuers. Nora's hands found their coat again without thinking. The storm demanded motion. The room seemed to condense into a corridor of action. Damon, who had been content to watch the picture of rescue from the safer edges, volunteered to fetch his SUV. His smile took the shape of a man who believed having horsepower equaled moral authority. He offered to coordinate, his voice lubricated by the virtue of resource. He barked directions with the self-assurance of a man used to ordering rooms. People nodded because the practical need for vehicles and men to move heavy things outweighed the nuisance of class hierarchies. Evan's face hardened into an expression Nora had begun to understand, the practical, pragmatic watchfulness of someone who did not let the polished edges of others' intentions hide what they might cost. "We should call the town crew first," he suggested. His voice was level, the kind that surfaces when you are negotiating how to contain practical risk. But the crew's number clanged through a loop. Roads were blocked, services overwhelmed. It was the winter logic of small towns. When infrastructure fails, people recombine into ad hoc rescue. The choice slid toward action anyway. People organized themselves,
Who would shovel? Who would hold the flashlight? Who would stay inside to care for the vulnerable? Nora found her arms full of blankets, and she walked toward the door with Evan beside her, the two of them moving not because of anything spectacular, but because there was an expectation between them of shared risk. As the door opened, the wind tossed a sheet of snow across the threshold, and then closed itself again, as if testing who wanted to belong to a community that required work. The street was a white world of motion. A car sat in an ungraceful heap, its hazard lights blinking like a small trapped animal. The driver, a young woman, was on the curb, shaking. The neighbor's voice, a man's voice that had the thin confidence of people who do not like to be seen as helpless, directed people to tow ropes.
The night smelled of metal and wet wool and the faint sharpness of gasoline. It was all ordinary rescue: ropes, hands, the communal use of muscle. Damon stepped forward with his keyring jangling, offering his SUV. It was a practical gesture, and yet Nora felt like an old ache, the undercurrent, the assumption that being able to provide resources meant you were entitled to direct how they would be used. He barked orders that were efficient but brittle. He placed himself at the hinge of decision-making, as if generosity morally conferred leadership. There was magnetism to his calm, and something less savory, the kind of control that shows up dressed as help. Evan, hands knotted in an attempt to steady a rope, looked at Damon. "We can do this by organizing," he said, "not one person deciding." His tone did not ask for approval. It set a boundary. Damon blinked, as if surprised someone would demand that help be distributed rather than performative. The tense air that settled was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was the small compression of people negotiating authority in real time. Nora felt an ancient instinct for safety kick in, the one that had once made her imagine older hands as harbor. And in that same breath, she felt something else, a renewed skepticism that what had looked like safety in the past could coerce her into surrendering agency. The bracelet at her wrist felt suddenly more like a lever than an ornament. They worked in concert, some shoveling, some looping the tow rope, some applying the precise measure of adult coordination to a problem that could be solved by a dozen willing hands. The car slid, the people breathed, someone laughed in the ridiculousness of being snowbound in a season when one expects to feel cozy. The young driver hugged the neighbor and sobbed in quiet relief. Hands were clasped in a small, earnest celebration. When they returned to the restaurant, all of them panting and flushed, the mood had shifted. People were quieter in a new, gentle way. The storm had demanded a kind of mutual risk that left community in its wake. They sat again with cups of coffee that tasted like proof. Mia, who had been at the heart of small rescue rituals, like a prophet of little things, leaned into Nora and said softly, "You did good." Her words were unadorned. They were the kind that cut through adult calculus. Nora realized the magnitude of what childlike verdicts can do. They collapse complicated negotiations into a single sharp truth. "You did good," it said. No ledger, no patronizing pity, just witness. For a moment, Nora considered what it would mean to accept an older solution, to hand over decision-making in exchange for the illusion of peace. The storm had shown her a different template, that safety could be communal, ordinary, and messy. Standing amid the warm hum of used plates and scent blankets, she felt something like permission to be both small and competent.
The bracelet on her wrist did not cease its tapping, but its sound was less like a countdown and more like a metronome. Yet even as gratitude filled the room, there was an undercurrent of other things. The way Damon's offer to help had placed him in a moral high seat, the way he had assumed gratitude would follow as if it were a natural law. And there were other quieter personal arithmetic, the ways Nora had let older men's presence relieve her of certain small responsibilities in the past, and what paying that price had demanded. She slipped her hand to the bracelet, feeling the cold of the metal and the warmth of the night, the weight of the possibility of trading a certain brittle assurance for the labor of being honest and mutual, settled comfortably, dangerously between her ribs. The night, however, was not yet finished. Into the glow of the candlelight, someone at the bar announced that there had been an accident further down the road. A car with a child inside had slipped off the bridge. Calls on a crackling radio described conditions, whiteout conditions, travel impossible for large vehicles. The announcement fell across the restaurant like a new question. Heads turned. The room grew smaller with the weight of what might be needed. Evan's face was suddenly stripped of the night's softness. He moved toward the phone with a brisk focus.
Nora watched him. In the way he reached for the device, his hand did not tremble. Grief had taught him to meet emergencies with a stillness that contained both fear and muscle memory. "We need to coordinate with the rescue teams," he said. "Someone should stay with Mia." That last sentence contained the kind of careful selfishness that parenting, especially lone parenting, compels, an arrangement to protect the child first. For a beat, Nora felt the old calculation flicker back, the idea that an older, more resourced partner might have prevented the need to choose who stayed and who went. Then she felt the more honest reply rise within her, that rescue was not an event a person bought from someone else, but something communities and imperfect partnerships made themselves into when they could not afford waiting. Evan looked at her then, with a kind of quiet question in his gaze. "Will you help?" It was not a dramatic invitation. It was a test of whether she would be co-laborer or spectator. Nora's answer was to nod and pull Mia's mitten onto the girl's small hand. Outside, the wind had turned into something louder, a force that made the threshold between inside and out feel like the edge of a small world. They arranged ropes, coordinated calls, and moved toward the door again. The room contracted, then opened at the seam to accept new purpose. Damon offered his truck again, his voice pitched to be heard. Evan's eyes, when they slid toward him, registered a hardening that Nora had seen only a few times before.
It was not hostility, but an insistence on equity. Help should not arrive with a price tag of indebtedness. Nora stepped into the snow with a rope slung over her shoulder. The cold hit like the flat side of a thought made flesh. Her breath condensed and then spun away. Mia gripped her fingers so tightly it was as if the child's small hand might anchor her heart. The night drew them into a quiet choreography, one foot after another, the shared labor of people whose edges had been softened by the day's events. It was during one of those steps, with snow in her boots and cold in her lungs, that Nora felt the old arithmetic she had set up in the margins of her life begin to bend. The idea that 20 years could fix what death had broken looked for a moment in the wind and the strain of pulling someone to safety, not like calculus, but like a naive trade, safety purchased at the expense of agency and the small dignities of daily life. They worked until the rescue team arrived, until the blue and red lights painted the snow in a different kind of language. The professionals took over with the clinical efficiency of practiced hands, and the restaurant's patrons retreated into themselves, like people who had performed the small miracle of being useful and now needed to absorb the cost. Back inside, the generator hummed its low, grateful chord. People spoke in exhausted tones and drank coffee like sacrament. It was late. Outside, the storm hurled itself against the world, relentless and indifferent. Inside, the room had that peculiar aftertaste of events that had both been and not been disasters. Gratitude blended with exhaustion and an odd, brittle elation that people who have helped survivors sometimes carry. Nora set her mug down, fingers leaving prints on the rim. And then someone, the night still thick outside, mentioned something that made the air in the restaurant change. A rumor, half-formed, that the candlelight vigil some circles had arranged earlier had also been photographed, staged perhaps, to feature charitable interactions between patrons and those less fortunate. A voice wondered aloud whether the evening might be used for a local paper's heartwarming column. Another voice added that an employee at the paper had contacted a friend of Damon's. An uncomfortable hush fell. Nora felt the old fear seat itself again. The possibility that her small acts of emotional risk could be framed as a tableau for someone else's virtue-making irritated something in her that liked the privacy of brokenness. If the night's rescue could be rewritten as an image in a column promoting someone's charity, then what would that make of all they'd done? Would gratitude be translated into a photograph of her vulnerability, captioned by someone else's largesse? The thought felt like being stripped of an argument in which she had been trying to speak for herself.
Damon, who listened more than most, smiled in that particular way that suggests control, and said, "It's good for the paper. People should know the town pulls together." His voice had the smooth certainty of someone for whom narratives welded to image make policy. Nora's mouth tasted of metallic irony. She felt viscerally the way a private rescue could be stolen and rearranged into a public show. Evan's jaw tightened. A shadow moved across his face like cloud over waterfall. "We didn't do this for print," he said softly, but the room heard the edge. "We did it because someone needed help." The statement was not dramatic. It was hand to hand. It reset the atmosphere, like a compass finding north again. People looked away from Damon and at each other. Patrons shifted, exchanging small apologies and awkward smiles. Patricia crossed the room and laid a hand on Nora's shoulder, the kind of touch that conveyed both thanks and the recognition that gratitude does not have to be performative. Nora found herself in the middle of a private war, the old temptation to accept the polish of an older man's narrative about how he saves the town, and the newer, rougher impulse to claim the messy labor of rescue as mutual and equal. She felt fatigue gnawing into her bones, an ache caused by the effort of pretending to be what others expected her to be. The bracelet on her wrist felt like cold metal and a long list of compromises. When the night finally cleared, the town woke like someone rubbing sleep from sore eyes, exhausted, a little ashamed of its own vulnerability, but oddly luminous from having survived. Snow crusted the sidewalks into glass, the streetlights threw long, apologetic halos. At Patricia's, chairs scraped as those who'd sheltered there gathered coats and stories into tight pockets. The generator shuddered, then steadied, a tired animal lowered from alert. Nora stepped out into the cold and felt the air as if it were a new kind of honesty. Her cheeks were raw, her hands smelled of coffee and soap and the faint pine from the restaurant centerpiece. Mia's small mitten still rested in her palm where it had been for warmth. The girl hopped beside her, dragging a cardboard and marker drawing that showed 3 stick figures under a fat roof. Someone had labeled the figures in crayon, Mama, Dada, and in a crooked, earnest scrawl, Friend. The drawing would eventually be taped to Nora's refrigerator, a small, stubborn contract of what they intended to try and be. They crossed the street where a photographer, bundled and blinking, stood on a curb with an expensive-looking camera at his chest. He had been following the night's events for the local paper, he said, hands suddenly smoothing the front of his jacket. Good story, he announced, as if that settled anything. Town pulls together. We'd like to run a pace. The words landed like a soft argument, flattering and invasive.
Within hours, the paper published a piece with a glossy lead photo. A man in a heavy coat handing a blanket to a woman who smiled with too much gratitude. The caption emphasized simplicity. Local philanthropist organizes shelter during whiteout. The article quoted Damon as praising community spirit and noted the generosity of several local benefactors. Nora's stomach hollowed as she scrolled through the day's notifications. Thin tendrils of irritation became a larger, more familiar ache. The picture that accompanied the narrative framed her as an object of benevolence rather than a participant in rescue, and the headline lent Damon the tone of a savior. It was worse in person. Damon, illuminated by his own photograph in print, stopped at Patricia's the next morning with a tidy wrapper of apologies and press-ready quotes. The paper did a lovely job, he said, handing her a business card that felt like a small blade wrapped in silk. It's useful for community morale. He praised the town for its resilience, and, with a practiced affability, addressed Nora like a beneficiary whose gratitude would be the appropriate polish to his reputation. We do what we can, he said, as if the balance sheet of his life neatly equaled charity. Nora felt the edge of humiliation first as heat at the base of her throat, then as a more precise tightening behind her eyes. Someone nearby laughed, badly tuned, at some private joke Damon made about putting folks like her on the map. The phrase did its work. It reduced a complicated night of mutual labor into a column of other people's virtue. She heard the soft little click of the bracelet against her wrist, and wanted for once the metal to disappear. Evan's hands curled around a coffee cup until the knuckles lightened. He'd read the piece too. He did not need someone to point it out. The room felt smaller as he faced Damon across a cluster of chairs. This wasn't your photo op, he said, but his voice held an exhaustion that made the sentence less like accusation and more like an exhaustion recited aloud. Damon smiled in that way he reserved for damage control. Not everyone can see the mechanism of good, Evan, he offered. Sometimes someone has to catalyze it. The word catalyzed had the soft, privileged sting of someone explaining how the world required his intervention to right itself. Evan's jaw worked. Good is not a press release. The statement landed like stone. Nearby patrons looked away from the small theater of 2 men asserting the town's grammar. Damon, not deterred by the flatness of Evan's rebuttal, leaned in, his posture the practiced lean of someone accustomed to being listened to. I only meant to highlight generosity, he said, and to show that people in different walks of life can be connected. We live in a town that values that. Nora felt something loose and old drop inside her chest, a small stone that had been sitting in her pocket for years.
She wanted to tell him, right then, what this had really been. Not a staged moment of his kindness, but a messy night where a dozen hands had been used to pull someone from ice, where people with no power had risked elbows and time and hot drinks. She wanted to name the patronizing tilt that had been the comforting lie for so long,
that an older man's polished benevolence was equivalent to true steadiness. Instead, she let the silence collect her. The bracelet against her wrist felt like an accusation as much as it did protection. Damon's voice slid around the pause, smoothed and hungry. "There are ways to make real change," he said, as if he had been born to explain routes to salvation. "Financial backing, public messaging. You could be the face of something like this. Think, elevate the issue." The offer arrived dressed as opportunity, but smelled to Nora like an old, familiar bargain. Her visibility in exchange for being legible in someone else's terms. She tasted the deal with the same distrust she had felt in the cab weeks earlier when she imagined older hands smoothing the day's responsibilities away. The appeal of that 20-year difference had always been less about chronological age and more about buying someone else's labor for peace. Now Damon wanted to extend his patronage into her life. Evan's hands made a small motion, not theatrical, but enough to show he wouldn't let her be discussed as if she lacked a voice. "She doesn't need a campaign," he said. "She needs to be treated like the neighbor who helped pull a woman from the road, not a charity case for someone's publicity." Damon's smile faltered only for a second. Privilege has a way of assuming there will always be another strategy. "You're defensive," he said lightly. "There's no harm in exposure." He turned his practiced charm toward Patricia. "Imagine a small campaign, the town's resilience, spotlighting those who help." For him, the evening's mess became a neat cause that could be managed and leveraged. For Nora, it became one more reminder that being visible often meant being rescripted. It was then that Mia tugged at Nora's sleeve. The girl's face was untroubled in a way adults rarely sustain. Children can, by dint of shorter histories, reach comfortable truths more easily than embittered grown-ups. "He looks like he wants a medal," Mia said, to no one in particular, but loud enough to be heard. Her voice was small and direct. There was no malice in it, only the clarity of a child who had noticed the shape of things. Some in the room laughed nervously. Damon smiled the smile of a man who expected praise to follow an observation. "We all like to be recognized for helping," he said, which was both trivial and revealing. Mia frowned, perplexed by the adult grammar. "But you left," she said simply, as if it were a factual observation that could not be negotiated. "You left, and we did the work."
The sentence dropped light and precise into the middle of the table, like a coin that proved the meter wrong. It hung there, undeniable. Damon opened his mouth, closed it. For once, his practiced words failed him. The room shifted toward the truth, that generosity is not measured by the size of one's wallet, but by the steadiness of one's presence. Nora felt something molten loosen in her ribs. Mia's observation was not an indictment of Damon alone. It was a mirror held up to her own choices. She thought of countless nights she had clung to the idea that an older partner would mean fewer alarms at midnight, fewer arguments about who picks up the dry cleaning, fewer moments when grief pushed her off balance. She had imagined trading the small labor of daily life for a smoother facing of the world. But that trade, she had learned, came with a cost. To be seen as delicate, to be scripted by someone else's narrative, to feel the silent pressure to perform gratitude. She looked around at the people who had stayed, at Patricia's hands raw from work, at the neighbor who'd lost his umbrella in the rescue, at Evan who had not tried to perform anything for the press. Her chest hurt. In that way grief had taught her before, like a bruise you touch to remind yourself it's still there. "I thought," she began, because confession, even to herself, had become a kind of currency she needed to spend. "I thought if I let someone older take the shape of my days, the ache would be quieter. It felt like buying adulthood." It was quieter than the room for a moment. The truth of it had the small sting of admission. "But it wasn't quiet," Nora went on, hearing the cadence of her own voice as if from across a table. "It became another job, keeping up appearances, always being grateful, always making sure I didn't take too much space, as if my grief was some animal to be pacified with gifts. I felt smaller, not safer. I was protecting a version of myself that I had learned in service of someone else's comforts. That connection would have asked me to give pieces I wasn't ready to lose." Evan watched her, the look in his eyes deep and careful. He had the weary, wise look people develop when they face danger often enough to list its contours calmly. "You were trying to survive," he said. "You were trying to make the world less loud for yourself and for Mia." There was no pity in his tone, only a recognition of mutual vulnerability. She nodded. "Yes, but survival looked like a catalog. It wasn't intimacy. It wasn't the clumsy, inconvenient kind of help people handed each other tonight." Her hands found the bracelet and tightened until the metal bit the warmth of her skin. "I'm tired of acting like I don't have needs, or like my needs are things to be fixed by someone else's largesse.
That performance became its own kind of burden, everything polished and never raw. I didn't realize the cost until someone tried to make me part of their narrative.
That was the word that seemed to shift something. Narrative. Damon wanted a story where he fit neatly into the hero column, and the town fit into his Valerie of virtue. Nora, for the first time in years, refused to be a footnote in someone else's press release. She said it aloud, not as defiance, to decide what we answer to. If you want to be seen as an equal, I'll answer that. If you want to be messy and ordinary and make 100 small mistakes, I'll answer to that too. We'll do it together. For a moment, the world shrank to the warmth of that hand across hers. It was not a grand declaration. There was no romanticized clifftop pledge. There was, instead, the practical certainty of someone offering to shoulder the daily grammar with her, the list of bills, the midnight terrors, the parental logistics. Nora drew a breath that felt like a small surrender, the careful kind, the one that lets you stop pretending not to be tired. But choices need to be named, and naming can bruise. I can't promise there won't be days when I want someone to be more decisive, more older in the ways I once longed for, Nora said, because honesty is the only currency she felt she could spend without bankrupting herself. I don't want to pretend I haven't wanted to be steadied. That wish is still there, but I won't pay for it with my voice. Evan nodded. I don't want to be a solution that erases your grief or makes you owe me. I'm just someone who knows what it's like to stay when it's easier to leave. If we try, it will be messy. If we fail, it will not be because you needed someone 20 years older. It will be because life is hard. He smiled faintly, the kind that acknowledges how ridiculous it is to try and schedule destiny. Promise me one thing, he added. Say when you need help. Don't let the old performance return. She laughed a little, the sound thin and genuine. Promise, she said. It was perhaps too small to be a binding contract, but in the kitchen of their small lives, it would be used like mortar. Damon watched them with the look of a man concluding a deal had gone off script. His mouth pursed, and he left with the kind of dignity that belongs to people who believe their own mission will be taken as magnanimity. He would, in later weeks, call the paper and complain about what he framed as misinterpretations, while privately smiling that the story had at least featured him. But for the night, his departure felt like the closing of a bad book. After that, the work of small reconciliations began. They drew lines in language and in routine.
Nora told Evan about the nights still punctuated by dreams, those thin, operatic slices of grief that make you wake with your hands clenched. She told him about the list of things she still did for the deceased partner's memory, an empty place at the table that she never explained because it felt like sacrament, a jacket that hung unchanged in the hall. Evan, in return, told her about a day he'd found himself at a bedside years earlier, palms slick with worry, making a promise to remain if he could. In those exchanges, there was no solution offered. There was instead the slow architecture of trust, repeating the same civilities until they formed the bones of something durable. Mia, for her part, had opinions. She arranged their mornings like a small general, insisting Nora taste the cereal before it went into bowls, and that Evan never, under any circumstances, forget to tuck a scarf into a pocket. She invented a ritual of leaving a paper star by the apartment's front door when anyone returned light as a sign, "You came back." It was child logic dressed as talismanry, and both adults accepted it with gratitude that felt like a religious act. The days that followed were not cinematic symphonies of healing. There were arguments about dishes left unwashed, about the way Evan sometimes shut down for hours, about the times Nora's grief would arrive like a wind that knocked everything off the mantel. There were also small, astonishing things. Evan demonstrating the art of reheating pizza without drying it out. Nora learning to change a car tire in those stupid, fussy winter afternoons. Mia drawing a picture that now included a third small figure labeled home. They learned each other's triggers, the sudden sound that made Nora flinch, the way Evan's shoulders bunched when he needed to leave a room. They learned how to apologize and how to hold silence when someone needed it. And they set rules about performance. When Damon called offering to host a fundraising gala and hinted that she might be a compelling keynote, Nora and Evan answered together. "We're not a charity item," Nora said in a voice steady with a new armor. "We're people who did something that night because someone needed help. If your gala is about supporting rescue services, fine, but do not make our lives into a story that erases our agency." Damon's voice, used to being placated by flattery, tightened into an almost admiral-like command. "You'd do well to accept the exposure, Nora," he said, and she, without theatrics, declined.
It was small and monumental in equal measure. Winter yielded to the ragged optimism of the holidays closing. New Year's Eve arrived the way small towns do, with half-promises and a shared idea that a date turning on a calendar could be a rehearsal for the future. They did not go to a party or dress as if the night required spectacle. Instead, they ordered 2 cold pizzas from a place that had burned once and continued on with life anyway.
Mia insisted they set fire to a single sparking candle because she had read somewhere about wishing with light. They ate by candlelight on the floor, plates balanced on cushions, snowflakes tapping the window like a percussion section. There was no cinematic confession on the cusp of midnight, no vow cast in the fireworks light. Instead, they sat close on the couch with a blanket pulled up to their knees. Evan had a paper crown from a takeout box perched on his head, and Nora had laughed until she felt breath go soft inside her ribs. When the clock moved toward midnight, they kissed, an unhurried, honest thing that tasted of cheese and salt and something like possibility. It wasn't the moment a lifetime had been erased. It was a small, necessary risk. 20 years didn't fix anything, Nora murmured later as they watched the dark settle like a blanket over the roof lines. And I don't want it to be 20 years older to be my safety. That would mean not having to do the messy parts. The bracelet tapped faintly against her wrist. Evan turned his face to her and smiled, a slow exhale smile. No, he said, I think what we've learned is something more complicated, that rebuilding is daily, that we choose it, not buy it. He reached for her fingers and held them like a promise being tried on for size. If you want steadiness, we'll try to be steady together. Months later, the shape of their lives had shifted in ways that were at once subtle and profound. Nora's apartment had a second toothbrush on the sink. There were 2 sets of boots by the door, 2 mugs in the cabinet that did not match, but somehow made a kind of domestic symmetry. The bracelet, long a talisman of defense, was still present. Sometimes she slid it off and let it lie on the kitchen table, as if to see whether its weight would feel different. Often it did, not because she was less scarred, but because the labor of pretending had been traded for the labor of being mutual. They learned to answer the world's curious gaze in small ways. When Damon announced a new round of charity funds with a press release that mentioned inspiring individuals, Nora and Evan replied with a short statement. We ask that any support be directed to local rescue services and mutual aid funds. Our community's work is collective. It wasn't a grand rebuke. It was a boundary. It was also, not coincidentally, a way to ensure that other people, who had the skinned hands and the ready muscles, would get material help rather than a photograph of someone else patting themselves on the back. There were days when the weight of her loss arrived like a sudden wind that knocked over glasses. Nora found herself in the grocery aisle, overwhelmed by a smell that had been ordinary once and was now a map of absence. She would call Evan in those moments, not to be fixed, but to be witnessed, and his voice on the line would be the steady place that helped the storm abate.
Sometimes she would make the pilgrimage to the small cemetery bench with Mia on a Saturday, and they would speak aloud about the silly, private things they wanted to remember. These rituals did not erase what had been lost. They tended it, like a garden in winter that required slow, patient tending. Mia, growing in her clarity, became their moral weather vane. She would correct them when they started to speak in the tones of pity or performativity, reminding them with an offhand sentence that people come in all shapes, and none of it should be a spectacle. Once, when Nora hesitated about whether to accept a modest offer to speak at a town meeting about community rescue protocols, the child folded a napkin into a tiny star and handed it to her. Say it like you mean it, Mia said. We don't need applause. We need people who will do things later. The simplicity of the advice was an ongoing gift. Do the work, not the optics of work. The town, too, changed in small ways. Patricia's restaurant became a place where volunteers left pamphlets about winter safety pinned to the corkboard. The local council appropriated funds for emergency salt and for the volunteer group that had manned calls the night of the storm. Damon, for all his press, found himself quietly shunted toward projects that attracted a fine sheen of publicity but yielded little tangible improvement. He complained in quiet circles, but his complaints found less fertile ground as neighbors learned the value of mutual labor over the polished narratives of single-donor salvation. One afternoon, months after the storm had passed and the roads had thawed,
Nora found a small, anonymous envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a photograph taken the night of the rescue, not the glossy, staged paper version, but an unretouched image of hands, workers, patrons, Nora's, pulling a rope across ice, breath fogging in little clouds. Someone had written on the back in a hurried script, for proof. She carried the photograph to Patricia's and left it on the owner's counter like a talisman. Patricia pinned it behind the register where anyone could see it, a kind of civilian relic. In the slow weather of their life, Nora carried the idea that the older man's solution had been an illusion, attractive because it promised ease, convincing because it suggested someone else could do the heavy lifting of living. But she came to see clearly that what she had wanted was not to be rescued from living, but to be freed from shame about living. That freedom did not arrive in neatly packaged forms. It appeared in the ongoing acts of showing up. A scraped knee patched, a midnight fever warmed, a conversation deferred and then returned to with gentleness. There were nights when the burden of memory still pressed like an old shawl over her shoulders. She would wake and find the mattress cold beside her, the habit of reaching for a body that no longer filled the space, a cruel automaticism.
On those nights, she would light a small candle, look at the bracelet laid beside it, and think about the ways she had once tried to buy a different kind of life. The bracelet had been an armor that had calcified into a set of expectations. Now, resting on the table, it felt more like a reminder, not of chastening, but of the choice she'd made to unlearn transactional safety in favor of a daily practice of care. The title of what she had learned could have been smug or neat, but she refused tidy endings. So she told the truth when people asked. Friends over the course of a long winter, neighbors at the grocery store, a woman at a parent-teacher meeting who had once asked, half in judgment and half in curiosity, whether she regretted her choices. "I thought 20 years would fix what death had broken," Nora would say. The sentence no longer had the trembling desperation of someone searching for absolution. It was a clear, compact confession. It didn't. It almost made things worse by making me small. What I'm learning is that the work of being alive with other people is the thing that steadies you, not a life you can buy. People listened, sometimes with the ache of recognition. They would nod as if acknowledging a shared history, the temptation to outsource safety, the danger in being reshaped into someone else's charity. A few of them would thank her for saying what they'd felt in the dark but had lacked the words to pull into the light. There was no sweeping renaissance. Grief's edges dulled in some months and sharpened in others. Anniversaries arrived like weather. But the difference was in the terms. She no longer sought a silver bullet solution disguised in older skin and polite speech. Instead, she kept choosing the scaffolding of a life built with another person, the ordinary scheduling of pediatrician calls, the negotiation of bills, the quiet mutual tending of small disasters. The burden, yes, it remained. Memory does not vanish. The daily tasks sometimes felt heavy, and there were mornings when the weight of being responsible for another person's breakfast and moods and brokenness was a precise reminder that love is labor. But the character of that burden had shifted. It was shared. It had edges they could discuss. It did not require her to be constantly grateful in someone else's story to be worthy of love. On a late spring afternoon, with the sky the exact bright of a child's drawing, Nora found herself standing in her kitchen watching Mia tape a newly colored picture to the fridge. A house, 3 figures in it, and a small, proud son. Evan placed a plate of pancakes on the table and took her hand. They had argued the night before about a washing machine that needed repair, and about whether to say yes to a small local hiring opportunity that would require Jane, their neighbor, to watch Mia for a morning. The argument had not been fatal.
In its aftermath, there was conversation and compromise, and the washing machine was eventually fixed with a neighborhood mechanic who worked on weekends. Nora looked at the bracelet, then at the people around her. The metal caught the light and sparkled with the same inconsequential brilliance it always had. She smiled, small and certain. "We'll be okay," she said, not as prophecy, but as the modest articulation of ongoing effort. Evan kissed her temple, and Mia, from the floor where she played with colored pencils, shouted, "Don't forget the star!" They laughed, and the sound was not a cure, but a kind of benediction. The house was imperfect and warm, and full of the small and necessary inconveniences that make a life. She did not pretend to be healed, nor did she want to make a promise she couldn't keep. The burden of grief and the labor of daily life lingered like an old song. Some verses had been rewritten, others remained. But she had learned to see the difference between wanting someone to erase pain and wanting someone to stand in it with you.
The older Anne fantasy she had once polished and performed for was not a villain so much as a mirror that showed her the shape of an easier lie. The real work required messy, mutual tending. As the light slanted later and the day cooled, she took the bracelet off for a moment and set it on the counter. It sat there, simple and finite. She could pick it up at any time. Often she would, as if to measure the distance she had walked. Tonight she left it, and the gesture felt like a small test. Evan busied himself with plates, while Mia hummed to herself, content. Nora thought of the line she had heard the night the storm began, how she had once believed that 20 years would fix what death had broken. It hadn't. But something else had happened. The illusion that would have cost her voice had been exposed and replaced by a daily, shared tending. The burden remained, yes, a weight and a responsibility, but it was one that could be borne alongside another pair of hands. She lifted her eyes toward the window, where the sky glowed with the last of the evening. Stars, distant and indifferent, blinked on. Mia peered up too, tiny fingers pointing. "Make a wish," she said. Nora wanted to tell her that wishes are not guarantees. They are compacts we make with hope. Instead, she wrapped her arms around both of them and held them close, feeling in that hold the long and necessary truth. Safety is not something you buy from someone older. It's something you practice, day after day, with people who will stay when storms come. If that felt like work, then let it be the work they chose.
And if you want more stories about honest love, second chances, and the labor of rebuilding, subscribe and watch the playlist.